following video is not made for kids. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello to my subscribers, it's the TFNG coming to you with what will hopefully be a successful review, much more successfully than my previous review of Transformers Studio Series Gamer Edition Barricade, which I ended up having to break into two parts. So here is the final Transformers Studio Series Gamer Edition figure that's been released so far, or the most recent one, and it is Transformers Studio Series Gamer Edition Deluxe Class Cliffjumper. So Cliffjumper is the fifth Transformers figure to be released in the Studio Series Gamer Edition line. I've already reviewed the other four Gamer Edition figures that have been released already. You had Deluxe Class Bumblebee and Barricade, then you had Voyager Class Optimus Prime and Megatron, and the order in which I just named them off is the order they are numbered in the Gamer Edition line. So, like most action figures of Cliffjumper that have been released over the last 2.5 decades, Gamer Edition Cliffjumper. The only difference between him and Bumblebee, the only newly sculpted part that he has, is that he has a new robot mode head that's based on his appearance in the Transformers video games by High Moon Studios. I could be wrong. Please let me know in the comment section if I'm wrong, but I don't think Cliffjumper actually appears in the first High Moon Studio video game, War for Cybertron. I think he didn't appear until the sequel video game, Fall of Cybertron. But he was given a deluxe class figure in the original Transformers Generations line in 2010 after Bumblebee was released, and the original Generations Cliffjumper figure had a head sculpt based more off of his G1 design than the War for Cybertron design. But this head sculpt, if it looks familiar to you guys, that's because the head sculpt that was given to Cliffjumper for the Fall of Cybertron video game is based more on his appearance from the Transformers Prime cartoon show, and that stems from the fact that at the time in the early 2010s, what Hasbro wanted to try and do is to have consistency with the Transformers franchise and have like one universal storyline covering the events of the Transformers and all the different characters. Is Hasbro decided, despite blatant inconsistencies with the different stories being told, was starting with the Transformers War for Cybertron video game and its sequel video game, Fall of Cybertron. The stories told in those video games, along with the stories told on the pages of IDW's comic books at the time, along with the Transformers Prime cartoon show, its sequel, Robots in Disguise 2015, along with the Transformers Rescue Bots cartoon series and Rescue Bots Academy. All those Transformers stories took part in the same universe and the same reality, and Hasbro called it the aligned continuity. And despite Optimus Prime and Bumblebee leaving Cybertron at different times, different characters being alive and then being dead in other series, Hasbro just wanted to have all the different Transformers stories being told in throughout Transformers media to take place within the same reality. And as far as the inconsistencies go, Hasbro just told Transformers fans and collectors just blatantly ignore the inconsistencies and just go along with the general overall story. So the aligned continuity did last pretty much a majority of the decade of the 2010s, but due to the inconsistencies, Transformers fans couldn't really embrace it wholeheartedly as taking part in the same reality. But for what it did produce some very fantastic and I believe well-received iterations of different Transformers characters. And despite Cliffjumper dying at the beginning of Transformers Prime, there's no denying the head sculpt that he was given for the Transformers Prime series. What is one of the more iconic versions of Cliffjumper out there. And it personally wouldn't surprise me if in a couple of years the head sculpt used here on Studio Series Gamer Edition Cliffjumper, if it's used on a brand new modern deluxe class figure of Prime Cliffjumper. So here's Cliffjumper inside his box one more time. Here he is. The artwork of him in his robot mode. You got the same arc here on this side of the box. He's the fifth figure to be released in the Studio Series Gamer Edition line. Got the same artwork here on this side of the box. Flipping the box around, you've got your product photos. There's Cliffjumper in his robot mode and his alt mode. Same alt mode as Gamer Edition Bumblebee, just all the yellow is now red on Cliffjumper. Transfers back and forth between both modes in 21 steps. And his one-sentence bio reads, Cliffjumper spots a horde of Decepticons preparing to attack Omega Supreme and unleashes defensive blaster fire. So there is a backdrop there, but again, as I said, I can't remember if Cliffjumper actually appears in the War for Cybertron game or if he only appears in the sequel game, Fall of Cybertron, so I don't know if that backdrop is from the first or second video game. But yes, I'm really impressed with how Cliffjumper turned out. One thing I did want to share with you guys, eyes, eyes with Cliffjumper, is that it was announced a couple of months ago that Hasbro decided, due to all the reports of Transformers figures with the plastic-free packaging in the open window packaging on Deluxe and Voyager class Transformers figures and Transformers action figures being decapitated and having their heads stolen, Hasbro decided to reverse their decision on plastic-free packaging, and they've decided that starting next year in 2024, plastic windows are going to return to the boxes of Transformers action figures. But one thing that I didn't notice until right now is that that the first part of the plastic packaging that's returned are the plastic tie downs that Transformers action figures were used being held in their boxes up until plastic free packaging was announced this year. And I personally have always hated plastic tie downs. I prefer the paper tie downs that have been used on the plastic free packaging the last few months for the current year of 2023. But yeah, I really hope that Hasbro and Cartoon will continue with the paper tie downs for how Transformers action figures are actually held in place, because the plastic tie downs here, like the one that you can see across Cliffjumper's chest holding him in his box, they're a real pain to get out. But here's evidence that Hasbro has reversed their plastic-free packaging, because bringing in Bumblebee's box, so you can see the right here on the artwork, they just recycled Bumblebee's art for Cliffjumper's artwork. They just replaced the head sculpt. But here on this side of the box, here on Bumblebee, Bumblebee was one of the last wave of Studio Series Deluxe figures where plastic-free packaging is being advertised on the side of the box. Here on this side, it's gone. It's not it's no longer plastic-free packaging due to the plastic tie downs. And so here's hoping that plastic windows will return to the front of none of the boxes on Deluxe and Voyager class Transformers figures. That's one thing I do miss. But yes, as you can see, the artwork used on Cliffjumper, it's the same exact artwork that was used on Bumblebee. They just did a color swap up and changed the head sculpt on it. But yeah, one thing that I'm trying to see if there's a difference. I don't believe. Oh yeah, there is. So um, here's a Cliffjumper. Here on the product photos on the back of the box is Cliffjumper. I believe the photo for the alt mode is the same, but the photos for the robot modes are the same because they're both holding different weapons. So there's just a quick comparison of Cliffjumper with Studio Series Bumblebee's box. When I took Bumblebee out of his box, I was really happy to see the paper tie downs, because they're really easy to get out. These plastic tie downs are a real pain. But hopefully I can get a Cliffjumper out of here with no problem. Can't remember if I read it yet, but yeah, I did read his one sentence bio that he defended Omega Supreme from a horde of attacking Decepticons. And so, in terms of originality, Cliffjumpers, if you already have Studio Series Gamer Edition Bumblebee, then pretty much the only difference separating Cliffjumper from Bumblebee is being red instead of yellow and his new head sculpt. So unlike the other Studio Series Gamer Edition figures that have been released so far, which have all been original brand new molds, Cliffjumper is a repaint with a new head sculpt. So in terms of an original design, technically Cliffjumper is not, because he's just a red version of Bumblebee. You could joke. Okay, but I still don't regret getting this figure and adding it to my Transformers collection. So without further delay, let's get Cliffjumper out of his box and take a close look at him in robot mode. Alright, and so here is Cliffjumper out of his packaging and transformed into his robot mode. I won't go into articulation too much since I already did it with Bumblebee, but I will say that the new head sculpt on Cliffjumper, the articulation seems even less limited than Bumblebee due to how his head is sitting inside his chest, which slants downward due to the shape of the robot mode chest being formed from the front of the vehicle mode, and also Cliffjumper's chin sticking out slightly. But yeah, I really love the new head sculpt that Cliffjumper's been given. Even I instantly thought of Transformers Prime Cliffjumper when I saw that head sculpt. I do have the original Generations Deluxe Class Cliffjumper figure that was released back in 2010, but unfortunately, just like with Bumblebee, that figure's at the bottom of a storage bin buried under a pile of other Transformers action figures, and it's also very difficult to transform, much more so than these new Studio Series Gamer Edition figures, so I apologize for not getting that version of Cliffjumper out for a size comparison, but I will do a size comparison with another deluxe class Cliffjumper figure, and I believe this was the previously released. This held the title of being the most recent deluxe Cliffjumper figure until this one was released, not counting repaints, but for a size comparison, here he is next to Gamer Edition Cliffjumper, next to Earthrise Cliffjumper. Earthrise Cliffjumper, a lot of his small stature is made up for by his large sniper bazooka. So yes, Gamer Edition Cliffjumper, he is a much larger figure than Earthrise Cliffjumper is. But yes, just imagine this figure having a head sculpt that looked a lot more like this, and that's what the original Generations Deluxe Class War for Cybertron Cliffjumper figure that was released back in 2010 looks like. And it also had a much darker shade of red. It was similar to the uh, I don't know if you would call this crimson red that's used here on Earthrise Cliffjumper, but yeah, the original Generations Deluxe Cliffjumper figure was a much darker shade of red than the new Gamer Edition Cliffjumper figure. This is more of like a cherry red used on here, but it is nice to see that these different versions of Cliffjumper also have different shades of red plastic used on them. And Cliffjumper does come with the exact same weapons as Bumblebee does. The only one that he can actually hold in his hands is the sword. His two laser guns, which are the exact same ones that came with Bumblebee, they're just. Let me just do a comparison really fast. No, I thought they were a darker shade of plastic, but no, they're the exact same. The weapons used on Cliffjumper are the exact same shade of dark gray plastic that's used on Bumblebee. So be careful that you don't lose though. Don't mix and match the weapons between Bumblebee and Cliffjumper. Otherwise, you could end up giving them. If you're OCD about Transformers action figures still having the same weapons they came packaged with inside the box, next then your OCD is gonna cause you to go out of control due to Bumblebee and Cliffjumper having the same weapons. But yeah, for another size comparison, here is Cliffjumper next to Studio Series Gamer Edition Bumblebee. Again, I apologize for repeating myself. The only difference between the two figures are the different head sculpts, but it is enough of a distinction along with Bumblebee's yellow parts now being red on Cliffjumper that you can distinguish them from each other a bit. And the way having them holding their weapons, if you wanted to, you could. You could have Bumblebee and Cliffjumper do the mirror gag where their weapons look like they're standing in front of each other's reflections. So yeah, that's just something you can do to further distinguish Cliffjumper from Bumblebee if you desire. But yeah, again, please watch my review of Bumblebee if you want to see the articulation that this figure has. It's a decent amount due to how it transforms and the robot mode kibble and how the different joints are shaped. But overall, both these figures I believe are pretty great and decent enough versions, especially for them being based off of their appearance in the Transformers video games. So let's get Cliffjumper transformed into his alternate mode of a Cybertronian car, and we'll wrap up the review. Alright, and so here's Cliffjumper transformed into his alt mode of a Cybertronian car. Same thing we saw with Studio Series Gamer Edition Bumblebee. It's just all done in red plastic now. The wheels do spin fairly well, although I'm hearing something catching on on the front right wheel here on Cliffjumper, so that's a little discouraging to hear. Here, oh, it was the fist. Okay, I didn't have the fist rotated all the way. Oh no, it wasn't. I don't know what it is now. But anyways, Cliffjumper is holding together fairly well, much better than Bumblebee. And unlike Studio Series Bumblebee on my copy, where it was easier to pop the roof off to get Bumblebee transformed, I didn't have to do that here on Cliffjumper. So at least the transformation joints on Cliffjumper are. Sorry for having him so low there. The transformation joints are more tolerable and easier to handle on Cliffjumper than they were on Bumblebee. There is one thing to note about transforming Cliffjumper is that due to his new head sculpt and that prominent chin I mentioned earlier, or sticking out. Unfortunately, yeah, like you just heard, there it is right there. Unless you get Cliffjumper's head angled down in a certain position, then the front top panel section will refuse to close up on you and it'll want to pop up. I tried to see if maybe rotating Cliffjumper's head would transform him better, but it didn't work, or due to how the new head sculpt is shaped. So, to transform Cliffjumper properly and keep this roof panel from popping off, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it in there, but one thing I kept doing was shoving Cliffjumper's chin down so it rested here on this gray base peg there on side of it, but you can't do that. You actually have to keep Cliffjumper's chin away. That way his head will be at an angle that this top roof panel will be able to close properly. So just note about that. That you've transformed Cliffjumper correctly, or at least you've transformed his head correctly if his chin is not touching that gray panel section. I'm noticing here on my copy of Cliffjumper, this back section, actually I guess you could call it the trunk. The trunk doesn't want to peg in place as securely here on Cliffjumper than it did on compared to Bumblebee. So I don't know if that's mold degradation already being found on the second version of this mold. Oh, but overall, I do enjoy how Cliffjumper turned out. And then, of course, as far as weapon storage, like the other Studio Series Gamer Edition figures, the only weapon storage is to just have the weapon stored on Cliffjumper's roof, and then you can put the other laser gun here on the back of him. So that, unfortunately, is the only weapon storage for Cliffjumper. For a size comparison, here he is with Gamer Edition Bumblebee. So if you wanted to, once again, further distinguish Bumblebee and Cliffjumper from each other, you can have the weapons facing opposite directions. But of course, if you wanted them to look like they're part of a team, and you can have the weapons facing the exact same direction. So yeah, that is nice there. One thing I wish they would have done, and this is just a minor nitpick with Cliffjumper, one thing I wish they would have done was made the Autobot logo on his chest. I wish they would have given it a white outline like they did, similar to what they did with Earthrise Cliffjumper here, where the Autobot logo has a white outline, so you can see it against the red background here on Cliffjumper. I mean, the Autobot logo being a slightly brighter shade of red, you can see that it's there, but it's very difficult to do it, especially if you have a light bulb or you're using looking at Cliffjumper through a camera lens that can't really distinguish two different shades of the same color that are on top of each other. So again, that's just a minor nitpick, but I think Cliffjumper would have looked better if his Autobot logo had a white outline and it wasn't just a slightly brighter either a shade of red than the actual red plastic used on him. So the wheels do roll fairly well, but just like Bumblebee, there's only a hairline of clearance space between the base of the vehicle mode and the tires on Cliffjumper, so you can only roll him around successfully on a very, very flat surface. But apart from that, I do wholeheartedly enjoy how he came out. So for the proverbial question of the review, do I recommend getting Studio Series Gamer Edition Deluxe Class Autobot Cliffjumper and adding him to your Transformers collection? I absolutely do. You cannot go wrong having this figure in your collection. Actually, I've said this with a handful of other characters whose figures I've reviewed recently, but Cliffjumper is one of those Transformers characters where he actually gets less figures than, despite being a beloved Transformers character, he gets far less action figures than Transformers fans and collectors care to admit. I believe, in between the Earthrise Cliffjumper and the Ember and now the Studio Series Gamer Edition Cliffjumper figure, I think the only other Cliffjumper figure we got in between the release of these two figures, Earthrise in 2020 and Gamer Edition now in the current year of 2023 when recording this review. I think the only other Cliffjumper figure we've gotten in between these guys was the Buzzworthy Cliffjumper, which was a repaint of this with the clear plastic windows switched out with solid ones, which was released last year in 2022, if I remember correctly, or was it 2021? I don't know. I never saw buzzworthy Cliffjumper at my local Target store or so. The Earthrise version is the only version of Cliffjumper in this mold that I have. But yeah, for being a red repainted Bumblebee with a new head sculpt, Cliffjumper isn't he's actually a pretty decent figure. And I do enjoy how he came out. One thing I like is that just like Bumblebee has red headlights, Cliffjumper has yellow highlights. So again, inverted color schemes between the red and yellow parts on these two figures. So that's really fun to see that. So one last thing I'll point it out again. Be careful when transforming Cliffjumper's head. You have to put his head at this angle so that this top, the middle roof panel section will close properly. Otherwise, it will pop up if you do it incorrectly. But overall, Cliffjumper, at least on my two copies, Cliffjumper is much easier to transform than Bumblebee because when I transform Bumblebee, it's actually easier for me to pop his roof off and then reattach it. But Cliffjumper, I don't have to do that. He transforms successfully. So I highly recommend you get this figure if you can. And despite being basically a red Gamer Edition Bumblebee figure, Cliffjumper is, in my opinion, a worthwhile figure to have in your collections. Thank you guys all so much. This has been the TFangeek, and until next time, you guys stay safe, stay healthy, transform and roll out. Goodbye, everyone.